Vale, perfecte. Moltes gràcies, Catalina, per aquesta presentació tan bona. I abans de començar, volia agrair també a la Maria del Mar per haver-me convidat aquí als seminaris virtuals del GRESIB i donar-me aquesta oportunitat de compartir la meva recerca. Moltes gràcies i també gràcies a tothom que heu vingut avui al vespre un divendres per escoltar-me, que em fa molta il·lusió compartir el que he fet. I crec que ara faré el switch to English because my presentation is in English and I'm going to share my screen. Is it working? Everything is all right? Okay, great. So shall I start? So as Catalina said, the topic of our today's talk is the linguistic versus sociocognitive nature of expressive pragmatics. What is it about in the preschool years? And since we talk about the nature, first the plan for today, our plan is, well, I briefly introduce the main research questions and I'll motivate them. I'll explain the 4 studies I conducted, and then we'll talk about the conclusions we can draw on the basis of the evidence of the studies, and we'll have a more general discussion. And the 4 studies I'm going to present form part of my PhD thesis, which was developed under the supervision of Dr. Pilar Prieto in the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, which I defended last year. And since we talk about the pragmatics here, we should probably start by defining it. So beyond common everyday acts of talking, I'm sure you've had many of them already today, like asking questions, answering questions, greetings, apologizing, etc. Behind this lies the pragmatic ability to engage socially. And this ability to communicate and to cooperate socially is celebrated as uniquely human. I would like to show you an example. Yes, it's a video from TikTok, but that's how we get access to some real data, because it's a mom's blog. She posts a lot of videos there every day of her son growing up. And it's an example of a usual communication between her and her son. Let's watch it together.
You have to stop sliding the coffee. It's okay, but you gotta stop sliding it because then it tips over sometimes and that happens. Mommy really wanted to drink that really yummy coffee that you made for me.
Okay. Can we clean it up?
Yes, I can help you clean it up.
Okay. Mommy, don't you have to do it?
It's okay, baby. Well, maybe next time I could drink a coffee. I needed that coffee today, Jonah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the end of the video. So something that we've just watched together, these short dialogues, it might seem very usual and natural to you, but it's actually, although it seems so effortless, it's a very challenging task for children. And let's analyze more in detail what's happening in this video. Okay, so in order to react appropriately to the social situation which is happening and produce a response, the child need to use appropriate linguistic means, which means to formulate and produce the sentences, which requires an active lexical and syntactic planning. So he has to produce this word, sorry, it was an accident, right? But apart from producing this verbal means, he also needs to accompany it by right multimodal, gonna move you around so it doesn't block my screen. So some multimodal cues. By multimodal here, I mean prosody and gesture. That in the part of gestures, we don't see much happening, but it's actually quite in a situation of apologizing. And as for prosody, we can see some strategies of multimodal mitigation, such as lengthening, because the rhythm of speech is somehow slowed down, and low intensity. He speaks in a lower voice, which also delivers this meaning of being sorry. I'm gonna show this short bit to you again. So there's clearly prosodically something going on too. And apart from this, he also has to take into account others' emotions, thoughts, desires, and intentions. So she has to understand that his mom is upset about what happened, not happy, that she wanted this coffee, as she actually said it later. So communication is complex because we need to acquire for everything which is going on there, all the three dimensions. How do children manage to navigate it? And how can we know whether they manage or not? This boy, for example, do you think he is good at it? How can we assess these abilities? And can we improve them? Can they be trained? Also, how much do different components add to these general pragmatic abilities? For example, multimodal part of it, is it important in this picture? Are they important here? So that kind of was a question that I tried to answer in the thesis I conducted and in the studies we've done. So as we said, pragmatic is the ability to use language appropriately according to communicative situations. But communicative situations also can be very different. That's why pragmatic is a multifaceted phenomenon. It includes different skills, such as the one which are popping up at the screen right now, such as speech acts, politeness, discourse markers, referring expressions, etc. It's all pragmatics, and they are acquired in different periods of time, but between 3 and 4 years of age, many of them start to emerge and others continue to develop. Why do we study developmental pragmatics? Why did we choose this topic? Because it's in the foundation for fully functional communication and well-being. Pragmatic ability affects children's lives, both the social and mental side of it in their day-to-day experiences. Pragmatics also lies at the basis of early language and sociocognitive development. And importantly, individual differences in pragmatic skills are positively associated with social skills and negatively with social difficulties, which means that pragmatic skills can affect such things as how the child makes friends, how she or he succeeds in school, how he or she regulates emotions and behavior. So given that pragmatic abilities can set a course which leads to certain developmental outcomes, either positive or negative, it's important to understand its developmental trajectory. And here we tried to take a step further here by investigating expressive pragmatics in preschoolers. We chose preschoolers, by preschoolers I mean young preschoolers between 3 and 4 years of age, because it's the age when clear individual differences start to emerge. Also, because this is a key period for the development of a number of pragmatic skills, for example, politeness-related meanings or narrative production. And more generally, because this is the first time in their lives when children start to be involved in the world beyond their families. They start the school or the preschool, so they have new peers, new teachers, it's a new social context for them and a new pragmatic settings to acquire new pragmatic skills. Coming to the theory, as we said, by definition, pragmatics lies at the intersection of language and social world. So it necessarily involves both components, the linguistic and the social one. The existing theories have different views on it. So for example, within linguistic tradition, pragmatics is recognized as almost one of the layers of language, such as phonology, syntax, morphology, so it would be another one there. And pragmatics is, well, the main focus is that pragmatic is related to structural language skills. There is also another view, which sees pragmatic as a social phenomenon that occurs during human interactions. And the set of abilities that allows us to interact effectively with others is known as social cognition. It includes such skills as emotion recognition, for example, understanding of mental states. Mental states are, for example, the verbs to think, to know, to believe, understanding of these concepts, and theory of mind, which is the ability to understand these mental states and the ability to predict and explain the behaviors of others based on this knowledge. So, for example, I know that an object is here, but I know that another person thinks that the object is in a different place. That's why I can predict that this person would look for this object, not where the object really is, but in the place he thinks it is, something like this. And within this more cognitively oriented tradition, pragmatics is seen as a component of, as a social ability to communicate and as a component of social cognition, sometimes even as a submodule of this. There is, however, a third view, more practice-oriented, developmental and clinical perspective, which says that pragmatic, and I like this expression in this picture very much, is a cup of competences. So you see, it's a cup, it's pragmatics, and it's a cup of competences because it can't be reduced to language alone or to social cognition alone. And within this perspective, it's recognized that pragmatics is complex and it involves, or at least can involve, different components at the same time. That was theory. Now, if we come to what we know empirically, on preschoolers, we don't have many studies, but the ones that were conducted found that there is an association with structural language, but not with social cognition. When I said not with social cognition, I have to admit that usually correlational associations are found, but once we account for another variables such as age or language, this relationship is gone. As for school-age children, there are many more studies, and they found that the association with both components here. However, many of these studies studied inferential receptive pragmatic skills, such as irony understanding or metaphor comprehension. So overall, there is a bias in the literature towards this receptive side of pragmatic ability. Well, we don't know much about expressive pragmatics, and we don't know, would it relate to structural language and social cognition in the same way? Would the pattern be different? Would we make a global assessment of pragmatic ability rather than focusing on a fairly specific things like irony understanding? That's also what we tried to do in the studies I'm going to present. But here comes the question, how we can assess these skills in children? No, sorry, it's another one. How to train pragmatic skills, because training studies are also a source of evidence of this relationship, but then can be promoted through different ways. As for pragmatics, there are not many studies, and again, they all focus on receptive pragmatic skills. And general focus of the previous literature has been on social cognition and specifically on theory of mind interventions. They were overall found to be effective, but again, we see the bias in the literature towards this receptive part of social cognition and pragmatics. Still don't know much about expressive pragmatics and multimodal interventions. Why do we talk here about multimodal pragmatics? Because human communication is much more than words. When we say something, it's not just what we say, but it's also how we say it. We use gestures actively when we talk. We use our hands, we use our head, we use different facial expressions, and this means can express a wide range of pragmatic meanings, such as the one listed here. In development, happens the same. Babies start to communicate well before they're able to speak, and yet they are able to interact with others. Because at these preverbal stages, they rely heavily on multimodal cues for communication, and they use prosody and gesture as bootstrapping devices, and they acquire and express different meanings through them. For example, speech arcs and information structure, epistemic states such as uncertainty, ignorance, incredulity, and politeness. So prosody and gesture play a key role in pragmatic development at different stages. But especially in babies use prosodic information to pass syntactic structures into clauses and to segment the speech stream into words. Gaze following, for example, is also found to be predictive of later language outcomes such as vocabulary comprehension. Referential gestures are predictive of a number of language outcomes, for example, later vocabulary size, the start of the use of two words combination. Both vocal and gesture imitation is predictive of language production and comprehension. However, it was mostly investigated in small children, like infants, really babies, but we don't know about whether this link holds later on in development, for example, in preschool children. Is it still the same? And here we come to the question, how can we assess it? Bearing in mind that our key area of interest is expressive pragmatic skills. When we started our research, we thought we can just maybe find an existing test or an instrument to use, but when we analyzed the list of existing instruments, we saw they were rather limited. For example, many of them had a form of caregivers questionnaires. So it's not a direct observation or test with the child, but it's based on teachers or parents, caregivers' impressions of the children. Many of them are done to diagnose atypically developing children. And again, many of them focus on comprehension and receptive abilities. So given this state of affair, we decided to develop a new test, which we called Audiovisual Pragmatic Test, APT, with the idea that this test would target usual pragmatic, everyday pragmatic users and will account for multimodal, prosodic, and gestural part of expression. So in this test, the child is presented with everyday situations, such as communication with mom, with peers, with teachers, and we try to elicit different speech acts. It's a production of different speech acts in a range of pragmatic areas and settings. And we made a validation study which showed that this instrument had good to excellent psychometric properties. So just putting all I said together, what's our goal here? So we want to investigate expressive pragmatic abilities in relation to two things. First, language, both structural and multimodal, and second, social cognition, and to explore ways to promote these abilities. And we'll do so by analyzing a cohort of children. It's approximately 100 children between ages 3 and 4. And we conducted 4 studies. We'll have a brief sketch of what they're about, so you understand the logic of the presentation, and then we'll focus more in detail on each. So the first study looks at the relationship with structural language and social cognition. That's our starting point. And it tries to answer the question whether pragmatics draws on structural language, social cognition, or maybe both. Then we analyze more multimodal language and specifically prosody. We analyze the pragmatic prosody profile and the relationship with theory of mind, trying to answer the question about the root of acquisition of prosody in pragmatic expressions and the role that tone theory of mind plays here. The next study is about gesture and the relationship between pragmatics and gesture, to see whether it's related to different gesture measures, such as gesture rate and gesture accuracy. And the final 4th study is a training study where we analyzed whether these abilities, pragmatic ability, can be promoted through multimodal training using prosody and gesture, and to see whether we can boost this pragmatic development. Okay, so the first study, which was conducted in collaboration with Luca Bischetti and Valentina Bambini, and it was published this year in Language Learning and Development. This is the background we already touched upon a little bit. So in preschool children, what we know is that there is a relationship with structural language, but not with social cognition. And what we wanted is to test a new type of pragmatic skills, specifically expressive skills, and include prosody. So the aim here was to explore the relative role of structural language and social cognition skills in expressive pragmatics and prosody. Our participants were 105 typically developing Catalan-speaking children. We managed to have so many participants because we contacted public state schools in Barcelona and we did the data collection in schools. And all children were between 3 and 4 years of age. This is P3 in Catalan system. I'm going to stop in detail on materials for this study because many of them are used in the following study, so we can skip it later. So to assess pragmatic prosody, as I already mentioned, we used our own test, audiovisual pragmatic test. The child is presented with pictures and the experimenter explains the situation to the child. For example, imagine I'm an experimenter and you're a child. Imagine that you and your mother are having breakfast together and you spill milk all over the table. It reminds you something, I guess, right? The situation we've just seen. What would you say to your mother? And the child can freely utter any response. So it's a semi-spontaneous speech. And there are a total of 35 situations like this, presenting a normal, usual, everyday scenarios that the child can encounter in their normal life. And we evaluate both pragmatic and prosodic component of the answer. To evaluate pragmatic component, we first see whether the intended speech act was elicited. and whether it was done in a socially appropriate way. So a maximum score of 2 is given for speech acts which were of high pragmatic quality, 1 for intent, if the intended speech act was elicited, but there was a lack of social adjustment, and 0 if there is no answer or no match with the target speech act. As for prosody, it's evaluated in terms, it was a perceptive evaluation in terms of how natural the prosody sounded. So the maximum score of 2 is given for natural sounding prosody, which is consistent with the speech act. 1 for unnatural, usually it means monotonous speech that mismatches sometimes with the pragmatic meaning, and 0 for no answer or indirect speech, because sometimes the children would say, I would say that. So it's indirect speech and we can't directly evaluate the prosody of this answer. I'm going to show you 2 examples of prosodic answers here. So let's have a look at the situation. Imagine that your mother leaves for work. What would you say as she's walking out the door? And here we have 2 examples from the children. And I think that just judging by the picture, you probably already know which scores was given to which. Let's listen to the first one. It's the same answer, adeu, yeah, bye-bye, but they're pronounced in a very different ways. So this is the first one. And now if you compare it to the second one,
Adeu. Adeu.
the second one sounds much more natural and expressive. And this one was given, the latter one was given a score of 2, and the first one was given a score of 1 for prosody. Okay, so this is pragmatic and prosody assessment. We also evaluated structural language. We had 2 expressive tests, one for syntax and another one for vocabulary. And we evaluated social cognition with a number of tests. First, we had a series of mind tests, which they're classical task, evaluating first order false belief understanding. I'm not sure whether I have to stop here to maybe explain it better, or are we all on the same page? Should I stop here? Okay, I'll probably explain it better so we understand what we're talking about. So for example, Sally and Anne task. You see there is a princess here and there are 2 containers. So the princess puts a ball in one container, let's say the golden one, and she leaves. And while she's away, a lion comes, and the lions change the location of the ball from the golden container and puts it in another one. Then the princess comes back and asks the children, where would the princess look for her ball? Usually, if the child is younger than 4 years of age, they would say that she would look for a ball in the right container. I mean, where the ball really is, because they don't have the understanding of false beliefs. They don't understand that someone can hold a false belief about the state of words. So if the child knows that the ball is there, the princess would also look for the ball there. But when children grow up, they start to have this understanding that even though you know something, the other person doesn't necessarily know it and can hold a false belief about something. So the princess would actually go for the container where she originally left it because she doesn't know that the location was changed. So it's a very simple task, and it's evaluated in terms of 0 or 1, acquired, no acquired, but it's a very powerful task to see whether this ability to kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes is acquired. We also evaluated emotion understanding and a metacognitive vocabulary, so the understanding of verbs such as to think, to know, to believe, to understand, etc. I'm skipping some results and I'm coming to the final results. We used structural equation modeling, which is one of the most comprehensive statistical techniques existing nowadays, because it can simultaneously assess the relationship between various dependent and independent variables. So it's ideal for mapping the network of associations. Let's look at our network. So we have false belief here, the princess tasks, right? Structural language here, which is made of vocabulary and syntax, age and pragmatics. And we want to understand what's going on between all these variables. And we found that actually only structural language was predictive of pragmatics, while others variables were not. And the same happened to prosody. Only structural language was predictive of prosody. So what we found is that this relationship between structural language and pragmatics and prosody is confirmed. And this is in line with the previous research on both pragmatics and prosody. And our main innovations here are that we tested a new type of pragmatics and a relatively understudied age was investigated. As for social cognition, that link was not confirmed. And here we have possible explanations. Perhaps it's the type of pragmatic skills, because we studied expressive pragmatics. We know it relates to receptive pragmatics, so maybe it has to do with this. Maybe it also has to do with the type of social skills we tested, or maybe age under investigation. As I showed, this relationship is found in all the children. So it is possible that this relationship also changes at the course of development, and it becomes stronger later on, but it's not yet strong in younger children. As for prosody, these results are in line with some studies on atypically developing children, but surprisingly, it's in contrast with the research on prosody of epistemic states. That's why in the next study, we decided to see whether tone relates more specifically only to some pragmatic areas and specifically epistemic meanings. That was the one goal of the study too. And the second goal was, because we saw some parallelism in findings for pragmatics and prosody, we wanted to look a little bit more into how prosody conveys pragmatic meanings. And this is the second study, which was done together with Iris Hübscher, Ingrid Villa-Jimenez, and Pilar Prieto, of course. A little bit of background. The majority of the studies that analyze children's prosody conducted with infants. It's early infancy studies. So they analyze very basic pragmatic uses, something like statement versus question, but not very sophisticated and complex pragmatic meanings. And we don't know much about what happens in later prosodic development. There are some studies, but it's a small number of studies, and they analyzed only some areas. Again, the contrast assertion versus requests, focus marking, some epistemic marking. But here we wanted to take this holistic approach to children's communicative uses of prosody and include many different pragmatic types. Also assessing theory of mind as a potential contributing factor. So our aim was to explore the acquisition of pragmatic prosody. By pragmatic prosody, we mean the ability to convey pragmatic dimensions through prosody while taking theory of mind into account. And it was the same children, the same pool. We used audiovisual pragmatic test, and here I'll tell you a little bit more about how the items are organized there. So we have assertions, requests, basic expressive acts, such as greetings, thanking, or apologizing, and complex expressive acts, such as congratulations or praise. And assertions and requests can be either unbiased or biased. Unbiased if it doesn't have any additional meaning, and biased if it has some kind of additional meaning, for example, an epistemic bias. So it's not an information-seeking question, but it's a confirmation question, or it's an incredulity question, or it's a surprise question. So it's not neutral in this sense. And for assessing false belief, we use the same task that we already talked about. So the idea here was to build kind of a collective profile of pragmatic prosody skills to understand and identify which speech arcs are acquired by this age and which are not. And this is the general graph of results. It is broken down by the type of speech arc. Every column is a type of speech arc. So this is, for example, unbiased assertions, basic expressives, unbiased request. On the y-axis, you have the number, the percentage of pragmatically appropriate responses, and the color marks the degree of prosodic appropriateness. And as we can see, at this age, children are able to produce all kinds of speech arcs, but there are clear differences. The majority of people deal quite well with unbiased assertions, basic expressives, and unbiased requests. And they have more difficulties with the last three, which is biased speech arcs and complex expressives. And this was confirmed statistically. So this is unbiased speech arcs, and this is biased. You see a clear difference, which was found to be significant. And the same for basic versus complex expressives. As for the role of theory of mind, we run a series of linguistic effect models by type of bias, by type of speech acts, but actually we found no direct effect of theory of mind, neither for prosodic skills nor for pragmatic scores. So the idea here was to sketch out a comprehensive pragmatic prosody profile, and we see that young preschoolers deal well with basic speech acts, and this is in line with previous work on international development. But they tend to have more difficulties with more complex pragmatic meanings. They only begin to use intonation for pragmatic bias marking, for example. And this is in line with the studies on the acquisition of other linguistic means for the expression of these pragmatic, difficult pragmatic meanings. For example, it's about this age, 3-4, when children start to word order, to mark focus, or use lexical markers to mark epistemic states or modal auxiliaries. So it makes sense in this sense that the prosody is on the same line. And as we see, theory of mind is not sufficient to explain and predict pragmatic prosody performance. We found no link with any of the speech acts, not even with epistemic prosody skills. And it's in contrast with the previous research on prosody, but actually in line with the acquisition of epistemic concept, which said that production and comprehension don't always go hand in hand. So we analyze the interplay between pragmatics and prosody here, but as we know, another multimodal expression mean of expression is gesture. So in the third study, we decided to explore a little bit more in details what happens, the relationship between pragmatics and gesture. And this study was conducted together with two master students back then, Eva Castillo and Yelena Grofulovich, Pilar Prieto and Alfonso Igualada from UOC, and it was also published this year in Journal of Speech, Language and Hearing Research. And here we analyze a slightly different type of pragmatics, narrative abilities. A narrative ability is the ability to string sentences together to convey extended discourse. It's a very powerful and very, very popular among practitioners and speech therapists measure to use oral children's skills. And narrative abilities, which was a side project that we did together with Eva Castillo, we found that narrative skills correlated with APT scores. So here we can be sure that it's just a different type of pragmatics. And gesture has been, it's a very well-documented relationship with language. Gesture in language is, gesture is predictive of later language outcomes, and gesture and language are very much intertwined. There are two different measures of gesture. First, gesture rate, and the second, gesture accuracy. Gesture rate or gesture frequency is just the number of gestures that the child produces while talking. And this number of gestures produced has been found to be predictive of and related to narrative development. Gestures have been also found to help narrative development. However, we don't know much about their concurrent relationship because there are some mixed results there. As for gesture accuracy, it has been claimed to be more accurate, more powerful measure of gesture. However, it's less studied, and it's usually analyzed in terms of how well the child can imitate an adult-produced model. So it's a more informative gesture, as some scholars said. It's also found to be predictive of a language development, for example, of language delay. And it has been used, gesture accuracy trainings were used to try to benefit ASD children, and this kind of training was found to be beneficial. And they were also found to be related to narrative skills. Here we wanted to see how narrative skills relate to these two different gesture measures to see whether they relate in the same way or maybe there are some differences. And we analyzed a subgroup of children here. It's only 31 participants, but actually we ran out power analysis and found that the sample size was enough to achieve small effects for the model we used. And I'll stop here on the materials a little bit more. For gesture rate, we used a context-based gesture elicitation task, which is actually APT. So some APT items can prompt the use of gestures. And we analyzed how frequently children would produce these gestures when answering APT items. So for example, this example that you already know about saying bye-bye to mom, here you see a picture of a girl spontaneously producing bye-bye waving while answering the item. So we would calculate the number of gestures spontaneously produced while answering it. For gesture accuracy, we designed a special task, which we called multimodal imitation task, which assessed the ability to accurately reproduce communicative gestures. And this task was based on the previously conducted training, reciprocal imitation training. Let's look at the example of this task.
Ara anem a dormir. Xxxt, que l'esmoleta està dormint.
Okay, so all the gestures are pragmatically based and it's a story. They all compound together to form a story. And the child is asked to imitate an adult model after being presented to this video. So here you have an example of a child producing this gesture of going to sleep. And narrative skills were assessed with a very popular Renfrew bus story test, and we assessed the narrative macrostructures of the stories. Okay, so coming to the results, we ran two multiple regression models, and we found that gesture rate was a negative predictor of pragmatic performance, which means that children who produced more gestures also produced more poorly structured narratives, while gesture accuracy was found to be a positive predictor of narrative performance, meaning that children who were able to imitate gestures more closely, more accurately, also produced better narratives. So here we have gesture rate and gesture accuracy, and the first one is negatively related to narrative skills. This differs from many of the studies on early infancy, and to be honest, we were a little bit surprised with this finding when we realized that was the case. And a possible explanation here is that gesture might serve different functions at different developmental time points. So maybe when they are crucial and so important at pre-verbal stages and predictive of language use later on, when words take over as a primary mean of communication, gesture use become less relevant. So something that holds for infants may not hold for preschoolers. Another possible explanation is that gesture here have a facilitating and compensatory role. So when the child doesn't have enough linguistic in the sense like syntactic or lexical means to say something, he would use gestures instead. And this is in line with some previous studies on atypical development and L2 learners. As for gesture accuracy, this is a key finding of our paper, that there is a positive association with narrative skills. And this extends previous research on early stages of development. And this relationship is very consistent. So we can observe it across different time points, and that's something that our study added, that it also holds later on across different time points, across different language skills, across different child populations, typically and atypically developing children. So the main message here is that different gesture measures reflect differently the relationship between language skills for organizing discourse and gestures. A quick recap of what we already know. Structured language skills predicts pragmatics. Multimodal language, such as prosody, expresses pragmatic meanings. Multimodal language gesture is linked to narrative discourse and ability. So we see that there is a link, and the question is whether we can use this verbal and multimodal language cues to boost pragmatic and also sociocognitive development. And that's what we tested in study 4. which was conducted together with Iris Hübscher again, Judith Holler, and Pilar Prieto. A little bit of background. There are some studies on training pragmatic abilities, and they're beneficial, but very few, and they do not target expressive pragmatic skills. Children are trained to understand irony better in many of them. As for social cognition, there are some interventions that found beneficial effects, such as task-specific intervention, but more general conversational interventions found mixed effects. For example, the improvement was found only for one task, but not for another, or the improvement was found only in one age group, but not in the other, or only after individual training, but not general group training. Here we wanted to see whether there is a potential positive effect of conversational intervention on a range of abilities. So we include both pragmatics and social cognition, theory of mind, emotional understanding, metacognitive vocabulary. But we also wanted to assess a multimodal part of it. So whether a multimodal intervention will be beneficial. The same children participated in the study. And that's a sketch of our experiment. So after some screening measures, we conducted pre-tests where we tested 4 abilities: pragmatic, false belief, mental state comprehension, and emotion understanding. Then children were distributed in 3 different groups: a control condition, non-multimodal, or you can say, you can call it verbal only condition, and multimodal condition. The training lasted 4 weeks. There was a total of 8 sessions, about 20-25 minutes each. And then the children were tested again on the same tasks to see whether there is an improvement. We use the same tests here, so APT for pragmatics and these 3 for social cognition. And as for training training materials, we adopted an existing existing materials that we used previously for a similar kind of training. We piloted it previously with a group of preschoolers in Girona. And it's a book of stories. Each story targets certain mental states. There is a total of 12 mental states, such as to be scared, to think, to remember, to be angry. And children in all 3 conditions first watched the stories. They were done in a form of cartoon. And children in the control condition carried out non-conversational activities. So they would just ask, for example, to draw characters from the story. Children in non-multimodal condition, after having watched the movie, the cartoon, were trained through a conversation with a teacher. And the conversation focused on the target mental states of the story, and they were asked to reflect upon these terms. For example, target mental state of the story, getting delighted. And one of the questions was, imagine that your friend finds a piece of candy in the pocket. What would he say in this situation? Okay, it's just a short glimpse to how the training really looked like. And in multimodal condition, children were trained through the same conversation, which also focused on mental state terms, and they were asked to reflect about these terms, but they were also asked to enact these mental states. What do we mean by enact? In the same situation, but instead of asking what would he say, we also ask what would he do. So he says, ¿qué diría en esta situación? ¿Qué faría? And the children are asked to get up and to enact and show what they would do. This is an example of getting scared, for example. Here you have getting angry or wondering. And an important note here that the timing was kept constant across conditions. So it's not like children in multimodal group did a longer training because they said the same amount and then they got up. No, it was the same time, So children in the multimodal condition necessarily were trained less in using these verbs verbally because some part of the training was dedicated to enacting these mental states. Our results showed that there was a positive effect, but only for pragmatic competence. There was no positive effect on none of the social cognition measures. And children in both experimental conditions, non-multimodal and multimodal, significantly improved their performance on the post-test. So we found this mental state training significantly contributes to the development of pragmatic skills, and that a new type of training, multimodal, is as effective as previously tested verbal training. And this is not a trivial finding because it shows that bodily actions can be as effective as words. So it's either you say it or you do it with your body, it's still beneficial. And this is in line with some previous studies within the embodied framework, embodied because you do it through your body. And they found effects, for example, on mathematical abilities or the learning of second language. And in general, it supports this multimodal view of language. So expressive pragmatics improved while social cognition did not. And this is in contrast with some previous studies that found that this kind of intervention can be, false belief focused intervention can be beneficial, but it's in line with previous conversational interventions. And our explanation here is that it probably has to do with the nature of the training. So the training that were beneficial, in those types of training, children were mainly trained on the false belief tasks, and not very surprisingly, they improved in passing these tasks later on. But while you do the conversational training, trying to get this understanding through different situations, and by using these mental terms, it's not usually found to be beneficial. It might also have to do with the nature of false belief tasks, because it's rather all or nothing ability. You either pass the test or you don't. Maybe this measure is just not sensitive enough to capture the effect of training, while the pragmatic test is. And here we come to the general discussion. A quick reminder of what we touched upon. We wanted to see how expressive pragmatics relates to social cognition and to language, both structural and multimodal. And in doing so, we analyzed early preschool years and typically developing children. And what we found is that pragmatic abilities rely more on structural language than on sociocognitive skills. And that pragmatic abilities rely on multimodal language too, because we've seen that multimodal cues express pragmatic meanings, they associate with pragmatic skills, and they can boost pragmatic development. So the main message is that, take-home message is that expressive pragmatics in preschoolers is intertwined with language, structural and multimodal, and less so with social cognition and theory of mind. So answering the question, which was in the title, what is it about in the preschool years? It's clearly more about the language rather than social cognition. And it has some theoretical implications. You remember the cup of competences that I showed you? Our results seem to speak in favor of the linguistic view of pragmatics, because we found that it's related to language, and it does not corroborate cognitive view of pragmatics. However, if we remember this developmental and clinical perspective, the situation might be slightly more complex. It is possible that we did not find this relationship for expressive pragmatics, but still that receptive pragmatic actually calls more on social cognition or a combination of both. And it's just important to distinguish between different type of tasks and skills here. And this is in line of a recent proposal of Andres Roqueta and Katsos that says that pragmatics is a multifaceted phenomenon, and we probably can't state that it's one thing or another. So although we found the relationship with language, we want to leave we want to leave open a possibility that the reality or a general picture might be a little bit more complex. And as for the debate on the relationship between pragmatics and Tom, it's like big literature. It's a big debate there going on. We found support to this claim of Francesca Bosco that pragmatics and theory of mind may overlap in functioning, but they are not identical, because theory of mind alone cannot explain pragmatic performance. And that's exactly what we've seen, because in study 1, we found that social cognition could not predict pragmatic performance. It was not enough to predict it. And we also have an indirect evidence for that from the study 4, because we found different training outcomes on theory of mind and pragmatics. Indirect in a sense, I'll try to explain the logic behind it. So if theory of mind and pragmatics were the same thing, the training would have affected them in the same way. But we saw that one improved and other didn't. So there are clearly different capacities. As for methodological questions here, I would just like to highlight again that expressive part of pragmatics is very often neglected, that it's important to include it in the research too. And that's why you have now this new wonderful tool that I encourage everyone to use, which also accounts for multimodal abilities, which are often neglected too. And I would probably here in this picture also add another component, which is multimodal language, because we've seen that it's very important for pragmatic ability. And as for educational and clinical side of it, we've seen that pragmatics is important for later social and psychological outcomes. So it's important to foster these abilities in children starting from early years, and it's very much needed. We conducted this intervention in a real context of schools, and it's a very easily applied intervention. And in order to promote it and to help preschool teachers with promoting pragmatic abilities in children, we did this educational website called Entrenem les Solucions, where the preschool teachers can find all the materials, all the instructions, everything to use and apply this intervention in the classrooms. And it also might be beneficial for you for other populations, for example, with atypically developing children that might have some language disorders or difficulties. And since multimodal intervention is less verbally demanding, it might be beneficial for them too. And some possible future directions would be interesting to investigate and compare different types of pragmatic skills and to see whether they develop differently or similarly. We can also assess a wider developmental window, because probably what we found applies only for preschoolers, but as we said, it is possible that this relationship between different components, if what we call cognitive architecture of pragmatics, is changing over the course of development. And a cross-sectional and longitudinal approach here seems to be fruitful. And we actually did a longitudinal study, which is a bonus study, as I called it. I'm going to explain it very, very briefly to you. So we went to the same schools 2 years later, where these children were between 5 and 4 years of age. And we passed some language tests to them. We passed, it's in English, it's called CALF, but I think here usually people say SELF, which assesses a number of language indices. And we found that pragmatics at term 1 was predictive. So pragmatic abilities at age 3 was predictive of a number of later language outcomes, such as core language, expressive language, content language, and structural language. And the most impressive thing for me about it, that because we also had measures of syntax and vocabulary at the 3 years of age, and those were not predictive of later language skills, while pragmatic was. And this shows that it has the predictive power of pragmatic for later language outcomes. And I think this is more or less all. I just wanted to thank the school that participated in our studies, our research assistant, of course, all children and their parents, and all my co-authors and the members of the GREB. Thank you. And if you have any question, I would be really happy to answer them.
Genial. Que guai. Moltes gràcies. Moltes gràcies per aquesta presentació amb tantes imatges tan xules i amb tant de colorets. Ha estat super guapo. Ara, qui tingui preguntes,